down there on the right, thanks. Hello.
At 12:10 hours Central Standard Time, on March 10, 1989, an Air Ontario Fokker F-28, Flight 363, prepared to take off at Dryden Airport, Ontario, Canada. It was a scheduled passenger service to Winnipeg, Manitoba. At the controls was Captain George Morwood, a safety-minded pilot with more than 30 years flying experience. His co-pilot was First Officer Keith Mills, a younger man with 10 years flying experience. The cabin crew on board Flight 363 were Catherine Say and Sonia Hartwick. Say was a flight attendant with 10 years flying experience who had earned commendations from passengers and airline management alike. Hartwick, with 2.5 years flying experience, was considered a valuable employee and was well liked by her colleagues.
Canada Radio, Ontario 363. We're ready for takeoff.
Following a short engine run-up, Flight 363 commenced takeoff. The aircraft rotated, but tragically failed to fly. After a second rotation on the takeoff roll, the aircraft battled to become airborne. It clipped trees and ploughed through a heavily treed ridgeline, eventually coming to rest in deep snow less than 1 kilometre from the end of the runway.
Come on!
24 people died.
Tonight on The National, Ontario crash. Some survivors, some fatalities as a jet goes down.
The plane took off in heavy snow and crashed seconds later about 2 kilometers past the end of the runway. The aircraft apparently dipped one wing shortly after takeoff, then stabilized for a moment before plowing into the forest. A passerby who arrived at the site shortly after the crash told me he saw burnt and bleeding passengers staggering away from the plane through waist-deep snow. Investigators say it will take days, perhaps weeks, to establish the cause of today's disaster.
There was wet snow falling at the time the plane took off, and the temperature was hovering around 0. Safety officials say weather conditions like that can create an icing problem for aircraft. Fire engulfed the aircraft after impact. That damaged the flight recorders in the tail of the plane and destroyed the tapes inside containing flight information. Paul Adams, CBC News, Dryden.
The Air Ontario crash prompted an immediate investigation by the then Canadian Aviation Safety Board. This was taken over by an exhaustive commission of inquiry into circumstances surrounding the accident. At the time, David Adams of the Australian Bureau of Air Safety Investigation was on exchange with the Canadian Aviation Safety Board. Adams led the Human and Survival Factors group of the investigation team and was subsequently appointed as a specialist investigator to the Commission. The Commission's findings reveal much about inadequate procedures, poor communications and corporate pressures which combined to seal the fate of Flight 363.
There were several important factors which contributed to the crash of Flight 363. Things had begun to go wrong early that morning when the aircraft was dispatched from Winnipeg with an unserviceable auxiliary power unit. While this is a routine situation for flight crews, lack of ground start facilities at Dryden meant that it featured prominently in this particular accident sequence. In addition to this, Captain Morwood was under considerable pressure since the flight was way behind schedule by the time it came to take off at Dreyden. It was the Friday of a long weekend, and passengers were anxious to make connecting flights. Ontario 363 had become more and more delayed throughout the day. This was mainly the result of poor weather, time taken to offload fuel so that extra passengers from another cancelled flight could be taken on board, plus being forced to delay takeoff in Dryden while a light aircraft attempted to land in heavy snow. However, these situations are neither unusual nor insurmountable for an experienced crew such as that on board Flight 363. These factors in isolation did not cause the aircraft to crash. To understand what led to the Dryden tragedy, we have to look more closely at the people involved and the circumstances leading up to the accident on March the 10th, 1989. We see that it was a combination of events and circumstances. Poor communication between members of the crew, possible fatigue, stress, and corporate pressures, which all played an important part.
Hi.
Flight 363 began its journey at Thunder Bay, where according to the flight release, it should have had 55 passengers on board. But after everyone had boarded, it was discovered that there were, in fact, an additional 10 passengers. They had joined the aircraft after their Canadian partner flight was cancelled. As First Officer Mills calculated, the additional load meant that the aircraft would be overweight for a landing in Dryden. Captain Morwood's initial response was to avoid further delays by offloading the additional passengers. However, he was overruled by Air Ontario, and so decided to act according to whoever got to the aircraft first, the fuel company or the airline ticket staff.
Dispatch.
The fuel company was the first to arrive, so Captain Morwood asked for 3,000 pounds of fuel to be unloaded, with the inevitable consequence of a long delay and mounting frustration among the crew and passengers.
How much longer is this going to take?
If only I knew. If it's not one thing holding us up, it's another.
Look, don't worry, everything will be fine.
Don't those guys know what they're doing? We should have been told about those extra passengers a lot sooner. Now we're way behind schedule. And if you ask me, the ground crew is not doing enough to help us. Yeah, I agree.
Don't let this get to us. We'll pull through. Delays or no delays. Just think of the long weekend ahead.
Yes, I guess you're right. Thank you, Sonia.
Oh, you're welcome.
Dispatch.
Flight 363 eventually departed Thunder Bay at 11:04 hours, 1 hour, 9 minutes late. The flight to Dryden was uneventful, and the aircraft landed at 11:30.
By this stage of the flight, the crew were feeling frustrated about being behind schedule. They'd been away for 6 days and were keen to get home, a normal reaction in this sort of situation. Captain Morwood would probably have felt more keenly than any of the others the corporate pressures of being late. He was known as a stickler for punctuality and felt a strong obligation to his passengers. However, it appears that at this point, he was still in control of the situation. When the aircraft reached Dryden, Captain Morwood went into the terminal to call the company dispatcher at Air Ontario to inform him of the delays and the fact that there would be a further delay due to an uplift of fuel at Dreyden. According to the dispatcher, Captain Morwood sounded his normal, professional self.
After Captain Morwood returned to the aircraft, he spoke to the general manager of Dryden Flight Centre. Morwood wanted the fuel load increased to 13,000 pounds, so the aircraft was hot refueled. At this point, Morwood noticed that fairly heavy, wet snow had started to fall. He remarked on this to the general manager and asked him if de-icing was available. He was told that it was, but that it didn't appear to be necessary. Everything seemed quite normal for pre-takeoff. However, at that point, a squall came over the aircraft and dumped a lot of wet snow. Some passengers were starting to ask questions about snow that was accumulating on the wings. At 12:02, Kenora Radio cleared Flight 363 for taxi to runway 29. Captain Morwood might have thought that at last he was getting his passengers underway.
Okay.
However, Kenora was also in contact with a light aircraft, a Cessna 150, which was in some difficulty attempting to land at Dryden in heavy snow. Even though his aircraft was fired up and taxiing, Morwood was asked to hold while the Cessna came in.
Well, folks, it seems as though a little plane has gotten in trouble out there right now.
We'll just have to wait a few minutes until he lands safely, and then we'll be on our way.
I hope. God knows how long we'll have to sit here now. I'll have plenty to say about this when I get back, that's for sure.
Had communications been better on this occasion, the flight attendants might have approached the cockpit to tell the crew about the snow building up on the wings. What's more, the pilots would have been provided with some valuable information. One of the findings of the inquiry was the urgent need to improve crew communication and coordination. Joint training sessions to achieve this and to help break down perceptions of one crew's role as being more important than the other were recommended. Responsibility for the safety of the aircraft and passengers rests with every member of the crew. The point here is that in the case of Flight 363, the crew were doing exactly as they had been trained to do. No fault can be found in the way they carried out their duties. What was at fault was the system which dictated the way those duties were to be carried out. Behind the story of Flight 363 lie all sorts of corporate stresses which placed an additional, unnecessary burden on Captain Morwood in an already extremely stressful situation. The takeover of a smaller airline by Air Ontario had forced the amalgamation of pilots from two very different corporate cultures. The F-28s had only recently been introduced to the Air Ontario fleet, their first experience of jet aircraft. Overseeing the introduction of the F-28 was a relatively young and inexperienced management pilot who was already overloaded, having to also serve as F-28 program manager, chief pilot, training pilot, and company check pilot.
As Flight 363 waited for the Cessna to land, one passenger in particular, a pilot with Air Canada, stared out of the window with more than just a passing interest in what he saw. He was watching snow accumulate on the F-28's wings. The pilot thought for a moment about sending a message to the cockpit about what he had seen, but decided against it, not wishing to appear as Mr. Air Canada telling Air Ontario how to fly its aircraft. He wasn't the only passenger feeling uneasy. On board was an officer of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who had also noticed the snow building up and decided he would ask the question.
Excuse me, miss. A lot of snowing on the wing. Are we going to be de-iced before we take off?
Oh, I really wouldn't worry about that. That'll blow away during the takeoff run and anyway, this wing has automatic de-icing.
Yeah, but that's only along the leading edge.
Say could only respond to this remark with a shrug of her shoulders.
This episode says a great deal about the boundaries of communications between the crew. In her testimony to the inquiry, Hartwick, the only surviving member of the crew, was asked for her interpretation of Say's gesture. She replied that she believed it meant something along the lines of, "Sorry, but it's not up to the likes of us to decide." So in spite of the police officer's prompt, neither flight attendant decided to go to the cockpit to find out if Captain Morwood was aware of the snow on the wings or to tell him about the passengers' concerns.
Okay, folks, the aircraft has landed and we're on our way.
At 12:09 hours, Mills radioed Kenora that Flight 363 was rolling 29 Dryden. At 12:11 hours, the aircraft crashed in a wooded area approximately 926 meters from the end of the runway. It burned for some time. 24 people died, 21 were seriously injured, another 24 had minor injuries. No one escaped unharmed. Watching that sequence of events, it appears that ice on the wings of the F-28 was a key factor in the crash of Flight 363. It was the reason that despite 2 attempts, Captain Morwood couldn't get the aircraft to fly before it plunged into trees less than a kilometre from the end of the runway. But could such a tragedy, and others like it, have been prevented?
The answer is yes. It could have been prevented. There are a number of factors which led to the crash of Flight 363, including the people involved, the corporate pressures, and the decision to put an aircraft such as the F-28 in poor weather into an airport like Dreyden, which had no ground support. However, one of the critical elements was the failure of the crew to communicate to one another. Sure, they were talking to each other, but they were acting not as one crew, rather they were two separate crews, a flight crew and a cabin crew. Air Ontario isn't alone in this, however. In airlines throughout the world, communications between the cockpit and the cabin are not always efficient and effective. Flight attendants sometimes feel intimidated by the mystique surrounding the cockpit and believe their remarks will not be taken seriously. The natural difference in the two jobs, the different circumstances in which they work, brings about a division. When this interferes with procedures, it's potentially dangerous. Often flight attendants feel prohibited from talking about technical matters and quite justifiably believe that flight crews don't regard such comments coming from them as legitimate. On the other hand, flight crews are so absorbed by what they have to do up front that they can often feel isolated from what's going on in the cabin behind them. They risk disregarding crew and passengers as vital sources of information. Captain Morwood and his aircraft felt the full effect of lax procedures on March the 10th, 1989. Poor maintenance meant that the aircraft was released to fly to Dreyden without an auxiliary power unit, even though Air Ontario had no ground staff facilities there. Captain Morwood therefore had to keep an engine running while the aircraft was refueled. To complicate matters further, the airline had a policy which prohibited de-icing of aircraft while the engines were running. So while Flight 363 sat waiting at Dryden for the distressed Cessna to land, Captain Morwood, following procedures, had to make a decision. Take off without de-icing or shut down the aircraft and strand his passengers there indefinitely. He knew there was inadequate accommodation for them in Dryden, and the aircraft, already running late, was due to be used on scheduled services later that day. Captain Morwood was also acutely aware that his crew were on the last day of their duty pattern and keen to get home to family and friends. Sadly, as it turns out, only one of them made it. No single factor has been pinpointed as the cause of the Dryden crash. The incident prompted one of the most intensive investigations ever carried out into an aircraft accident, and as a result, some 200 separate and broad-ranging recommendations for change have been made. As an examination of what happens when systems and communications are inadequate, it has lessons for all of us.